Hello, everyone. My name's Hank Vanden Bogart, and I'll be your TA for this organic chemistry lab for this semester with Professor Arnab Maiti. The goals of this presentation are to improve the safety in the undergraduate organic chemistry labs, make the students aware of possible accidents during the lab experiments, and increase the students' knowledge about the use of highly reactive chemicals and reagents, and clean and well-organized lab environment, which means no accidents and no chemical contamination. One of the most important aspects of working in the lab is to always be alert and aware that accidents can and do happen sometimes. And as long as we stay aware, we can keep ourselves safe. Here on this first picture, you can see there was likely a fire and they had to put it out with a fire extinguisher. And here on the right, you can see a broken beaker and the chemicals were spilled. One of the most important things with these small accidents is to make sure everything is cleaned up. And here you can see is an example of some much more serious accidents that can occur. If you haven't already heard of this story, it's always taught to me every year. I've always heard it. This girl was using a reagent called tert-butyl-lithium, and she was alone in the lab. She was not wearing her proper PPE. She was using this chemical which is highly reactive in moisture and air, and she made a mistake and her sweater caught fire and she died as a result of her injuries. This is one of many examples of what can happen in the lab if you're not careful. Here we see another example in which here it says college chemistry professor died from exposure to rare form of mercury that was synthesized more than 130 years ago. So it's really important to stay alert when you're in the lab and always be very careful. Now, there are a number of places you can call when an accident occurs. Of course, we call the one everybody knows as 911 in case there's a very serious emergency. Whenever any accident happens involved in any kind of injury, it's always important to call campus police at 747-5611. There's also the EH&S office, which is the safety office for UTEP, and their number is, of course, 747-8135. The 747 you always have to dial if you're calling from a number outside of UTEP. There's also, we can call Dr. Maiti at his office, 747-8778. And then there's the main office at 747-5701. Why is laboratory safety important? Well, there are many reasons, of course, but one of the reasons is to prevent adverse health effects from exposure to chemicals, to organisms, diseases, and other things in the laboratory. Also, to prevent laboratory equipment hazards, which if they're not handled properly. Everybody needs laboratory safety training. That includes professors and anyone else who happens to be working in the laboratory. The person in charge of the chemistry labs is Ricardo McCreary. He works for the Environmental Health and Safety Office, and his office is located in the Chemistry and Computer Science building on the ground floor. It is always good to review laboratory safety, no matter how many times you've taken the course. Before the start of the undergraduate organic chemistry labs, it is always necessary to cover these things. Now it's time to go over some of the important guidelines to keep us all safe in the lab. Approved safety goggles must be worn at all times. No food or drink or smoking is allowed. Of course, nobody smokes indoors anymore, but smoking also includes vaping, so none of that inside of the lab. Closed-toe shoes must be worn because your foot needs to be covered in case chemicals spill or some broken glass falls on your toes or something. Work is permitted only during scheduled laboratory times, so no walking in before or redoing labs or any of that stuff. You have to know the location of the fire extinguisher, safety equipment, and the nearest exit. Do not use broken or cracked glassware. that goes into the broken glass container. This next rule is pretty obvious. Never taste or smell chemicals. Obviously, you don't want to have any of that in your body. There will be cases where you make something like aspirin, which you would think is safe or whatever, but it's not because other things were made in these same glassware and you don't want cross contamination. Avoid contact of chemicals with skin. Always use your gloves, and they're always provided for you. Dispose of chemical waste as directed by instructor and EH&S. Clean your work area and put away all equipment and glassware before leaving. Put paper, trash, and broken glass in their specific containers. Keep the balance and prep rooms clean. Here's a list of some important protective equipment. Goggles, gloves, and lab coats. Always have to be wearing them when you're working in the lab. This includes even if you're not at the fume hood doing an experiment, you should always keep these things on you. There's also this thing here, which is an eye wash station. You use this in case you get chemicals in your eyes. You should rinse it for a very long time in order, just in case something ever happens. This will help you. There's also the safety shower in case you get chemicals spilled on you. You want to get those off your body as quick as possible. So the way this works is you pull this lever down and the water comes out of this end. But of course, never play with the shower because some of the labs don't have drainage for them and they make a huge mess. There's always a fire extinguisher in every lab. This is absolutely necessary because accidents happen and experiments catch fire sometimes. Of course, it's a given, don't wear sandals or anything with open-toed shoes or any of that. And no shorts in the lab. Always have all your skin covered. When working in a chemistry lab, it's always important to have safety first in mind. If you're unsure about anything, the safety or any of that, please make sure to ask your TA, which is me, about any of the lab experiments if you have any questions. Always keep yourself well informed. If you want more information, you can always see your instructor, Dr. Maite, and he'll give you whatever you need. And we'll now go over some examples of situations in the laboratory which can be dangerous. An inspection done by the Environmental Health and Safety Office on February 11th, 2020 showed that there were students in the lab that were left unsupervised. 2 of the students had water bottles and no eye protection, and this is very much not allowed. To correct this matter, it's very important that no students enter the lab without the TA's approval. I have to allow you to enter the lab. Nobody can enter the lab if I'm not inside. I cannot leave you guys unsupervised. This is just for your own knowledge. I never will if we ever have a lab together. No drinks or food allowed in the lab, ever. You can get any of those chemicals they release fumes and they get into your food and your drinks. So do not bring any of that. Always wear your safety goggles. You don't want to get any chemicals in your eyes. It's bad. On this slide, you can see a problem associated with working in these labs. You can see here there's a bunch of glassware cluttered on both sides. Also, oftentimes there are glassware inside of the sink. You can see here in this slide as well, you can see a lot of clutter and all of that. This is not safe to do this. So do not leave any glassware in the sinks or around here in this area. Make sure everything dries, but if there's no room on this one, you can go to another one in the same lab. There's plenty of room. And if some of these are dry, you can also always put them into the shelf that they belong in. Balances are a very important equipment used in chemistry labs. They're very important in order to get the right stoichiometry. You need to know how much you're putting into your reactions. However, whenever you're using a balance, always make sure this doesn't happen. Don't be a mess. If you spill, please clean it up. Don't leave it for someone else to clean up. Also, please do not leave any items or open containers close to the balance. Don't leave any chemicals close to the balance, as mentioned before. Move all the chemicals to their initial locations. Of course, during these labs, during regular times, a long line forms for everyone who's collecting this chemical for the reaction. It's okay to leave them for a moment, but once everyone's done with them, please put them away to where you found them. Every reaction produces waste, and it is important for students to be aware that there are different waste containers for different kinds of chemicals. Certain liquid wastes go into the aqueous waste, others go into halogenated waste, and others go into non-halogenated waste. If you have any questions about which chemicals go where, please don't hesitate to ask me. It's always better to be safe than sorry. Don't just assume that something goes in one place or another if you're not really sure. This is very important because explosions can occur. Another important thing is please don't leave pipettes in the fume hoods. When you're done with a pipette, please dispose of it properly. There is a specific container for broken glass, and these pipettes should go into that container. They should be available to you in the lab if you're ever working inside of it. If not, there should be a special container that the TAI will put for you to dispense of these. As I mentioned before, used pipettes go into the broken glass box, and this will always be available for you to use. These bulbs right here, you don't throw these away, we reuse them. Make sure you don't get any chemicals inside of them because they can mess with your reactions. Just make sure that they're kept clean, and then once you use them, put them back where you found them. On this slide, you can see an example of the different kinds of waste containers that are used in the lab. You can see here these three are the liquid waste containers. They contain, this one is the aqueous waste container. You can see here it says aqueous. This one is the halogenated waste container because it says halogenated right there. This is the non-halogenated organic waste container. Anything with that dissolves in water goes in here, and these two are for organic liquid wastes. This fourth one here is for solid waste. In here you throw away anything that was maybe a filter paper, solid, anything solid like your chemicals that you used, any of that stuff. Here you can see the logs for each of these different containers. Always make sure you fill these out when you're throwing things away, and make sure that each of these has the correct amounts that you put into the container. Of course, it's hard to tell what comes out of a reaction, but make your best guess on what it is that you actually threw away. You can see here an example of the broken glass container. It's always got a cardboard box with plastic wrapping inside. Always make sure to dispose of used pipettes into these boxes. Of course, this box is very full. You might want to contact your TA to have them exchange it with a new one. Another important thing to mention is the fact that these equipments are all specific to their stations. You can see here there's 6B and this is 6B from a different color. Always make sure that the correct equipment goes into the correct fume hood. Never leave things scattered throughout the lab. I'll make sure that in case this happens, that everything is sorted out before anyone leaves the lab. Of course, this is a pandemic time, so we don't actually have in-person labs. But if you ever do have an in-person lab, this will be a very important thing to note. Again, here you can see a larger picture of what the fume hood looks like. You'll see this has the white label, labeled 3A, 3B. This is a blue label. It does not belong in this fume hood, so it would need to be moved to its correct fume hood. Again, as I mentioned, you can see here, this is 4A. These are all white labels. Of course, if you could see the full fume hood, you would see that this is a white labeled 3B. And clearly this doesn't belong here. It needs to be moved to 4A, blue. Every lab has these kits available with glassware in them. Each of these has a certain amount of glassware and it needs to be put back after use. So once you wash them and dry them, they need to go right back into their respective kits. This is important because, as you can see here, TAs will take into consideration students' adherence in the lab in their grade. So cleanliness here is a part of your grade. Oftentimes, many experiments end up needing to use the same chemicals we had synthesized one day for the next week. And we sometimes store them in these cabinets here, right? However, at the end of the lab, we need to make sure all of these cabinets are cleared, all the chemicals disposed of, and the glassware cleaned properly. As I mentioned, these need to be emptied before the semester is over. Well, I will work closely with you in discarding the waste to make sure you dispose it into the proper container. You need to also make sure everything is properly cleaned. And here we see clearly labeled a container for solid waste. Always make sure everything goes into its appropriate location. Once again, this is very important to know. The under serious emergencies, always call 911. If there's ever any kind of accident involving injury or anything, it's important to contact the campus police at 747-5611. Always make sure you dial 747 if you're using a cell phone or anything that's not a landline at the university. The number for EH&S is 747-8135. They also need to be contacted whenever something occurs to file a report. It's also probably important to call Dr. Mighty at 747-8778 and the main office at 747-5701.